Hello everyone, today we talk about the Gastraphetes, literally belly bow of the 4th, probably also older times BC. As we will see now, the chronology is important because we have here essentially the first torsion catapult mechanism, starting from what effectively was a crossbow, right? A hand bow invented in the Hellenic world, as we will see now. There are some reasons here technologically why it occurred there. Naturally, consider that these are somehow archaic times. Still, we don't know much, nor so especially from an archaeological point of view, it's difficult to recover kind of information on this early machinery and bows and mechanism we'll see now. Because also the sources do not make, say the documentary ones, do not make it extremely clear, right, how this thing came about, specifically from how long was it around. Sometimes you read, I don't know, Ozi's book from the Bible, and you realize that for quite ancient times, older than these, there were already some kind of, in fact, generic machines, right, that of course were at that point the product just of a later historiography who either filled the gaps in Hellenistic times in the texts with terms that could fit the more updated times, where naturally in Hellenistic times you have the boom of torsion engines, together with an important, in fact, development in parallel also of fortifications and siege warfare overall. That the term polyursatics comes from the nickname of one of the, in fact, the most committed of these Hellenistic rulers in talking about Demetrius the first, Polyurcates, in fact, who was credited with the construction of gigantic machinery, and actually his military curriculum was not particularly impressive, and that should tell you a lot regarding our technologistic prejudices, for which we think that war is fundamentally a matter of technologies just per se, while that is kind of minimal and always bent to the tactical and strategic needs and not the other way around. And it's a relatively mysterious topic that, however, is, as far as the technicalities are concerned, in fact, but that is not so strange once, in fact, you are able to contextualize it a bit better in the warfare of the time. So the chronology here, we will today speak of this like an introduction, then we will look at the structure and the mechanism of the Gastraphetes. We will make some considerations about its performance that is unknown, telling the truth, because at the end of the day, it's just like, I don't know, in medieval times, right? As you know, as a medievalist, I studied consistently also siege warfare, this kind of engines and this stuff, especially for the early 14th century, so where you have almost a comparison with the Hellenistic era in terms of the boom of before firearms, of all the largest, kind of more complex engines and so on. Just recently made a video about the siege of Acre, in which we discussed this a bit, but also made other videos. There is a siege warfare playlist I created specifically. I don't remember whether I already differentiated it between ancient and medieval. In any case, you can find plenty of information there about the general issue. Then we will see here the structure again of the bow, how we think it worked, also those elements that we say the most delicate ones, and the most such as the trigger mechanism that we don't have, at least from this originary times, but it's relatively simple. Then we will look at the broader picture of how and when we know that these machines were created, which operations specifically were, also geographically, considering what was going on there at the time, and then express some judgment on the possibility that some fortifications of the 4th century BC would have been created to lodge these, to optimize, let's say, the performance, the employment, of such early artillery, which I think is foggy, to say the least, and there are also some doctrinal matters to consider. How were these weapons employed, and how much did they vary? We don't have quantities about that, so we can make some comparison with other eras and not so much. So as far as the chronology is concerned, we have the historian Diodorus Siculus writing that in 399 BC, the catapult, literally the catapelticon, that is to say, a machine that could, throwing machine that could shoot projectiles capable of piercing shields, because that's literally, it means kata through, and the pelta was the shield, right? So the idea of something that had a kind of an increased power, listening the shot, was invented, let's say, at the Hellenistic court of Syracuse, under Dionysus the First, the tyrant of the city. Now, the place and times, as we'll see now, is kind of not random, because Syracuse was essentially at that point the most powerful city in the Greek world. It was extremely, let's say, advanced technologically. It was essentially at the outskirts of the Hellenic world, right, in Sicily, against quite different enemies than the ones that the Hellenes had in their motherland, and so that was also through tyranny evolving a kind of bit more of a mercenary professional system, probably but territorial policy that entailed also a lot of siege warfare, probably conquest of cities like the ones existed all around in Sicily against other Greeks, against the Carthaginians. And therefore it makes a lot of sense, right? Syracuse would remain one of the great, eventually Hellenistic capitals. And we will surely look at it. We made some videos about Syracuse and warfare here and there, especially if you look at the Hellenic warfare playlist, you will find that. But we will have to continue, because it's a really interesting context in the first place. And in this, fervent central kind of scientific, philosophical, technological development, we have in fact such invention that, as we will see now, doesn't necessarily mean that this thing had been created in Syracuse. As a matter of fact, as we'll see now, the inventor came from yet another Hellenic city of southern Italy, but that had also been, this is the most important thing, that he had been employed by others, including not just Dionysus, but you will probably be surprised, at least if you had never heard of that, actually by the Oscans. Just recently I've been talking about Italic warfare, and as we will see, during the Sabellian siege of Cumae, we have this allegedly, probably from a chronological point of view, this very first employment known of catapults, right? So this is not like, I don't know, in the Peloponnese or in Attica. This is in essentially southern Italy, but also in an area was kind of Hellenic Italic, kind of in nature, from among peoples that were not, in that case, at the vanguard of technological development. I mean, in especially the Oscan mainland. So that is also fascinating, because it tells you how much war they did comparatively, even just considering the Hellenic colonies in southern Italy, and how eventually the Oscans would not remain particularly advanced technologically until Rome actually took over and then acquired such Hellenic and Hellenistic techniques. That's yet a topic we've never addressed, but there is an interesting historiography about it. I mean, especially how Rome gradually acquired this larger amounts of Hellenistic technology from the Greeks, from the Carthaginians, throughout the fourth, the third century BC and beyond. But today we do not talk about that specifically. But bear in mind the times and places, because this is very interesting. Consider that the Hellenic world had started since the Peloponnesian War to open to kind of full professional all year military engagements, right? Also on kind of regional scale that required such technological development as well, especially for siege warfare. Thus, what we're seeing in Greece, in parallel, is also the development of important fortifications for this territorial dominions. So you understand that somebody here was selling a product that was quite performing, because at least it would develop in what we know better as catapults. But what we see with the Gastraphetes is technically a crossbow, for which we will also have to make some point at the end regarding, for example, the comparison with the sling, with the self-bow, etc. Because that's also how was this weapon employed exactly, right? Doctrinally speaking, like you could find large numbers just in open field, and or was it just something more like in siege warfare? Because the mechanism is different from the for example, medieval sieges, where you have overall kind of type of crossbows that are suited for different types of roles, and you find them in open field as much as in siege warfare. Here it's probably the same, but not quite in the same measure, right? And we do not know much. Also because, say, I don't know, in the Middle Ages we don't have much sling warfare, for example, as compared to the bow one, at least for how much we know it existed in ancient times. And especially at this point, when somebody said that actually the sling at this point was even a kind of more effective weapon overall than the bow. And what's the limit between kind of a siege weapon and a hand one? Because if you look, say, even at firearms, the musket that became a handgun fundamentally was born as artillery, and because it was massive, right, and it remained for a while, right, until technology refined it better for individual use on properly in open field. But as you know, there was even a rest and something. And probably the Gastraphetes had, in fact, a similar employment as far as we understand. Everything is rather foggy, right? So aside from what Diodorus Siculus says, that is just this precise year, 399, we can naturally think, and this is perfectly compatible with his statement, that the Gastraphetes was already around from a while. Unfortunately, we don't know anything, literally anything about that, right? Surely, from a philological point of view, could go dig, like, I don't know, that quote from the Bible that I made before. But again, mostly this comes, in fact, like in that case, from later traditions, right? So it's obvious that there was a lot of siege warfare. I made a video about, for example, the Assyrian siege technology, right? That more or less up to that point had been and remained also in Achaemenid times the most advanced, right? The Assyrians really brought siege warfare to a stage from which eventually even a technology like the one of the Gastraphetes could develop more kind of easily, right? And more or less there were some basics that had not been altered together with other machinery. We know naturally that in Hellenistic times, just think about Alexander, even the siege of Tyre, etc., this kind of broader technological accomplishment would be brought to an unprecedented scale, and massively improved during the reign of the Diadochi, for example, and eventually by the Romans on the base, in fact, of the Hellenistic accomplishments, and so on. And we are pretty aware, however, that there were some origins that we cannot exactly focus on. The works we can rely is, again, in the histories of Diodorus Siculus, we have this insight. Then we have a work from the Roman times, Hellenistic engineer Heron of Alexandria, other, as you know, great Hellenistic capital. Think about its library. Most of the scientific research they made there was philological, right? There was comparably no kind of broader technological potential at the time. In any case, the great Hellenistic capitals like Alexandria, Syracuse, we've seen it now, Corinth, Pergamon, Rhodes, were all big centers of kind of technological production, right? Because also, at least some of them, especially the smaller city-states, were quite compact, and they could accumulate a lot of wealth without actually carrying out a territorial policy like a regional territorial land grabbing. And look at Rhodes, for example. And they would spend for these technologies, albeit with not much of a room for employment in that sense. If not, on Rhodes is a good example because it held out against the Romans for a long time, but it was favored by its location and so on, and so being entrenched in that kind of conservative Hellenistic mindset, and eventually being taken over by the Romans anyway, that were significantly less developed technologically speaking. So proving again that technologistic prejudices are just dangers per se. In any case, the name of Heron is definitely connected with a lot of this kind of Hellenistic theoretical mindset. And so if you look at the Holy Pile, for example, this essentially was a steam engine, right? They had it, right? But the possibility of implementing it in the ancient world was minimal, right? You needed probably, in fact, the colonialism of the 17th and of the 18th century to gather enough resources to invest in certain kind of components to, say, I don't know, compress the steam enough to channel its force in an engine that could effectively bring to things like, I don't know, the locomotives and so on. So in the ancient world, these were gained, right? They used them just at court, again, of Hellenistic realms that were radically, massively, and brutally based on essentially latifundia, right? And so hardly with any possibility of implementing these technologies in other ways, given that the world simply worked in another way. It's not even about slavery. It's not even about it's not about mindset in that regard. It's literally, if it had been convenient, they would have used them, right? Even if it was not convenient enough. Yes, it's also a matter of different. I don't want to be too teleological here or positivistic here about it, but if you consider what could be the applicability of steam engine in the ancient world, well, it would have been extremely costly, but probably minimal gains, right? And you cannot compare it definitely to the economical or social or political situation of the modern age. In any case, it's thanks to these Hellenistic scientists that we have knowledge even of this work. In fact, I mentioned Heron because he wrote this work, which is the Ctesibio Pelopoica, that is essentially Crataebius' manufacture of missile weapons. It is quite meaningful. And he illustrates the catapult in many ways. At that time, naturally, everything was much more like the Romans had brought these technologies to their extreme, right? But Heron makes a history of it, and he states that the catapults, as were known at the time, had been inspired by an earlier mechanical weapon that is, in fact, the belly shooter. We will explain why the belly, because you essentially had to load it with your body weight and you compress it on your belly. And another author that wrote before Heron between the 3rd and the 2nd century BC, so in closer times to the ones of the invention, and in a context like Pergamon, where, as we've seen, probably it was quite of an insight at the Attalid court on this kind of technologies after Alexander, after this stuff had been really implemented practically and also regularly in warfare. And Wu is a bit on being an author actually that was for a while historiographically thought to be a fraud of some sort, but is actually a pretty reliable source. Describes two, in fact, already advanced forms of the same Gastraphetes, right? And he credits such weapons to a Tarentine engineer, Zopyrus, who may have been active, in fact, towards the end of the 5th century BC. And this would have been essentially the same guy that would have brought such hand weapon to Syracuse, and also in the aforementioned siege of Cumae. Thus, kind of helping the spread of such invention, even if it was in the air already. Again, it was not invented the day before. Surely Zopyrus was not even the inventor himself. It was a concept that, again, they already had the technology. They already knew how to do the thing. It's after all it's a pretty simple concept. It doesn't require a particular intelligence to create a weapon like this. The problem is finding the right moment, historically, politically, militarily, to implement this technology on a meaningful level, so that it can be applied successfully, right, and also doctrinally, tactically, to an important effect, right? So that's the moment. The reason why we're talking about the Hellenic world, say, why didn't this happen in the Achaemenid Empire? Well, that's an interesting point, right? The reason being likely that surely the Achaemenid had the technology as well. I mean, we would probably be surprised by how many peoples, even among the barbarians, had technically the capacity of doing that. The problem, again, is what interest they could have in fact, in implementing it in that base. Well, the Greeks, as you know, were quite urbanized. They were booming as a civilization at that point. They had these important middle classes, let's say, that were interested, naturally, kind of diversified economical investment. There was not already that kind of Hellenistic stagnation that would, in fact, bring, as I was saying before, to, yes, those Hellenistic courts to discover, invent, make this kind of new toys, but not really able to employ them in many other ways, except warfare, where, as you understand, we were saying before, the need of having a catapult that shoots, massive projectiles at important distance, etc., was quite important. It was all a technicality in there. Rarely, yet also in that field, but say these weapons were used in a pitched battle, right? We do have knowledge of that. Probably it's been underestimated. However, most of these weapons were used primarily in context of siege warfare, taking out single towers, structures from which the enemy could shoot unopposed. So there was naturally artillery and counter-artillery. It was the same thing, basically, depending on whether you were shooting at the walls or from the walls. And the objective naturally was kind of suppressing the enemy, on the walls, for example, or from the walls to destroy the enemy battering rams or siege towers approaching, things like that, right? And artillery was mounted over the same structures and beyond. So the necessity, again, in this quite active, kind of fragmented, so where you have single polities that are fundamentally trying to survive, because otherwise the other would take them over, would deeply urbanized and fortified context would bring, with an important availability of resources, and crafts and kind of trade and kind of worldview of a certain type, surely the Greeks had opened, so in a quite technical and modernly scientific sense, from which also much of our thinking derives, makes us understand that a weapon like this was to evolve. The Achaemenids maybe had tried with this stuff, but they were a much more kind of feudal power with a more archaic mentality. They had such a huge military force that even the necessity of being so precise or refined or sophisticated in terms of, destroying a single tower was probably less important than, again, even putting forces in motion. Just look at the Persian wars. There were surely siege machinery of different type already at the time that were brought, but the important was moving the army. It was a much bigger problem, and at that point you could simply make some cities surrender even without a siege proper. It was just the numbers. There's no doubt in that sense the Greeks were, for example, already more advanced at some technological aspects, but that they were also the weaker side. Right, when the Achaemenids invaded Greece was more backwards, militarily speaking. This is something that is usually never said. It's like when say, they passed from copper to bronze and everything changed. Well, it was actually an insignificant, gradual process. Actually, even later with bronze and iron, everybody knows the bronze is actually better in many ways than iron. That it really there is an economical principle behind it on what kind of quality that iron is, what it's used for, and in which quantity you can produce it, right? Not necessarily more advanced times. There's not really a linear increase in technological development. You can't say, well, this thing is, there was more iron in the Iron Age because there were polities that could spend enough to armor larger quantities of men. Whereas before, this men were essentially more autonomous and they could, defend themselves kind of individually better, not because somebody had a control on that, and so you would have even actually perhaps a greater quality of equipment from the average soldier before, but collectively actually less of an effect. We were talking about that for the same Roman army. You don't have necessarily to think that it's a Marian legionnaire was more qualitatively equipped than, say, in terms of sheer kind of, the armor kind of protection, etc., than a 3rd century BC princeps, right? The important was the fact that the Marian soldier was a professional one, capable of carrying out, collective tactics that at the time of the 3rd century BC, the Manipular Legion could not really perform because it was not trained at that collective scale to do. And so you even needed, that was so effective that you even needed worse equipment in a sense, right? And we know actually a few, again, about quantitative data. And yet that's the order of ideas. And of course, the Roman army at that point kicked ass without much more than it had done before. So there are some kind of, you can't take it just as a technological thing, first of all, but you have to understand, again, what were the political and social contexts, because without that, you can't really approach the topic. I discussed, as you know, much about the Roman army recently, last winter, exactly also in these terms. Like, let's talk about what that practically meant, what it meant for Rome to expand in the Mediterranean, what kind of, doctrinal. It's anachronistic to talk about doctrine. The Romans didn't even have a linguistical equivalent of the term strategy, but of course strategy was there, that how to employ these weapons was there, so we have to try to interpret this stuff through sources that reasoned in very different ways from our own, and yet that knew how to employ the military means quite effectively, as we know. So it's all, again, a matter of how to explain the Gastraphetes if you don't first make an attempt to contextualize the background. It's practically useless. So looking at the structure per se, in its original form, the Gastraphetes consisted of a powerful composite bow, this aspect is interesting because there's surely an Eastern influence that may have played a role, right? The composite bow is naturally more powerful than the on average, of course, than the self one used in Europe that was always the same since prehistory and would remain always the same later on in the West. So here there is naturally a consistent civilizational influx from the Levant, from Egypt and so on, so that the Greeks had also kind of blossoming in from within up. And the reason for this is, of course, that this is also complicated, like meaning why didn't the composite bow even spread further west at some point? Well, evidently the way it was employed didn't require to have such an increased power, right, but just other type of characteristics. What would be developed here as a crossbow, eventually as artillery, is different, because there you want to maximize even the shot in terms of properly the physical sustainability of the system that has to shoot different projectiles at a time, not really operating as a sling or as a bow on the battlefield. So that's why also the concept of doctrine is important, right? And naturally, the composite bow required very specific material. You couldn't really find it everywhere all the time. You couldn't simply construct artillery, in fact, everywhere. The same reason why, I don't know, Hannibal could not de facto besiege Rome after Cannae, because you need important amounts of Asian woman hair to build artillery in the 3rd century BC, and that is all that must be imported. There was a significant trade behind this. There were countries, for example, who didn't have much wood, like Egypt, that still, however, managed to have enough supplies to develop those extreme, in fact, siege technology capabilities. Take that in consideration. These bows apparently, of course, were not more numerous than the normal bows, right? Normal bows dominated, and this can help us understand better what this kind of crossbows were for, right? Naturally, there were kind of simple composite bows there, right? Other peoples that the Greeks say even hired as mercenaries, etc., used them. It was there, right? So this is just talking by degrees, not saying this weapon was like this and this was like that. Just there were many different shades. There was a spectrum. There were different material, different size, different construction, and so on. It's the name of Gastraphetes, so belly shooter, stems from the concave rest at its rear end, against which the archer braced his stomach while drawing or spanning the bow, right? And this composite bow was mounted transversely on a stalk, right? So that it took the form of the crossbow, right? It's the same identical concept, and this stalk functioned in a peculiar way because it comprised two features crucial to the development of the catapult later. One was the syrinx, or pipe. The other was the diostra, or slider, right? And you understand the concept here, because syrinx is the same, of course, of syringe. The principle being the same of the syringe, in fact. The syrinx was the body of the weapon. So the bow was fixed to the front of it, transversely, right? It had this concave rest to the rear, and the syrinx had probably a track, right? And the diostra was somehow shorter board, dovetailed on top on the syrinx, so that it could slide forwards and backwards freely, right? And that's the concept, of the pull backwards with a bowstring, and there you had, in fact, on the rear end of the diostra, a mechanism which included a claw for gripping the bowstring, and also a trigger to release it again. Right, the trigger mechanism on the Gastraphetes, as we see, was in the rear of the slider. So on either side, a pole was engaged with a linear ratchet to hold the slider in position. Right, so it would prevent it shooting forwards unexpectedly. Right. Thus, the trigger could be wedged beneath the claw and forcing it to grip the bowstring. Right, and by pulling the trigger, of course, you would allow the claw to flip up, and you would release the bowstring. You could throw the projectile that was installed over the diostra. So the mechanism is quite simple, as you understand. Aside from the trigger that we can reconstruct also on the base of what we know in general of the technology of the time, and it's not quite complex just per se. We don't have an exemplar, right? From those times, know exactly how these first pieces, especially, were developed and so on. In any case, you can easily make a weapon like this, right? So again, also in terms of the targets, we will talk about it later. There was a specific use probably that these weapons had. I mean, that they could be, of course, employed in many ways against any target, but there was something also in terms of increasing, just like the probably the effect against more armored troops or thickly packed one. And this during siege warfare required these weapons to be placed, preferably also in some positions rather than others that are not always so obvious per se. We will see it later, right? So as we've seen, in order just to load it, you would have the weapon at the rest, and then the archers led the diostra forwards along the syrinx until the trigger mechanism fell level with the bowstring, whereupon the claw was engaged. Right, and so by propping the front of the diostra against an immovable object, such as the ground or a wall, right, the archer could essentially push with his entire body to bear on the stomach rest, hence the Gastraphetes, as we've seen. Because eventually the pull was great, right? It was greater than an average bow. So the archer's weight forced the diostra back along the syrinx, pulled the bowstring with it, and thus spanned the bow. Probably, in fact, these weapons were not made to be thrown by hand. It would have required too much power, and you had to do that with your body, right, compressed against another, say, like a wall or anything fixed that wouldn't move. But you needed to use an important part of your body strength in order to load this weapon. So when the bow was at full draw, the weapon could be lifted into a firing position. And about this, again, we don't know how large these machines were. We understand that it could have been probably shorter than a meter, right? And if you look at the syringe as a wall, the point was, again, how much they could be pulled, but you could have, in this sense, also much greater kind of spanning force with also holding mechanisms. We'll talk about it now. So we don't know about that, and consequently we don't know exactly how these weapons were employed, even just because of their size, which is practically unknown in the quantity of the variation. Now, if these weapons were, say, properly heavier and bulkier, then of course significantly at least than a bow, they could be propped on a wall, for example. Otherwise, the archer could have needed a portable prop, right? Just like as we were saying before, the one used by the musketeers of the 17th century. At this point, of course, by the way, the bow had to be loaded, right, with the arrow placed onto the ostra. There was this ready-made groove cut along its full length, depending also which kind of projectile was employed. We don't know exactly how, in fact, what was the lodging that pushed the bow. Like they also, of course, made part of it, but there could have been something more kind of enclosing to avoid and kind of further movement from the groove. And pulling the trigger, of course, caused the claw to release, as we've seen, the bowstring, and the arrow would be shot. Consider that on catapults, as we've seen also from other videos, you could shoot also small, actually even some large, in case of the largest machines, balls that were also, in fact, smoothed and made as spherical as possible. In that case, however, we're talking also about very heavy boulders that were chosen, in fact, to smash properly in the enemy's fortifications. The arrows were better suited for kind of penetration of some sort, but mostly is connected with piercing somebody's body, rather. So the projectiles could be different in kind, and it would evolve over time. However, it's fair to say that at least the Gastraphetes as a crossbow was mostly shooting arrows, and I can think of many other ideas. And the debate that arose is mostly on the passages of Bitten and the chronology of Dionysus, right? The context that Dionysus provided, right? Because some thought, because the term catapult that is used by Dionysus doesn't explain whether we're talking about the Gastraphetes proper or an artillery of sort, right? We just know that at the opening of the 4th century, you have this catapult presented at the court of Dionysus of Syracuse. Some scholars, in fact, proposed that such a weapon was a full-blown Persian catapult. Others said that it was just like the crossbow, right? Naturally, the Gastraphetes could be called a catapult, right? The catapelticon, it's if you look at the etymology, it says there is no such thing like when reading classical sources and saying, there is a rigid linear categorism about this. A Gastraphetes was a catapult, technically. And it probably, the catapult was probably developed from the smaller weapons, not the other way around. Thus, the concept of, again, piercing through somebody's shield, by the way, and or armor, evidently started from the need mostly of attacking troops, not fortifications per se. Then eventually the name stuck to it because it says it's a catapult, right? It just shoots this stuff, and it was naturally employed also against enemy personnel, as we will see now. So it was not just merely developing, even as a catapult, only for fortification use. So that's what we mostly don't know about these early weapons. How were they normally employed? It's obvious that they could be employed in both ways. The problem is that we don't have historically any evidence to quantify that, and how many variations, even in the structures, accordingly to that employment, the specific employment existed, as I was saying before. So we don't even know whether Zopyrus mentioned by Bitten was the guy who went to Syracuse, or not, right? Probably these were maybe other people, right? Some of his colleagues, maybe even some of his friends. Maybe they worked together. However, it seems probable that this technology was being developed in southern Italy, and that many people, by the time this invention reached the court of Syracuse, already knew how to build one. They had already been employing them, and that they were toying with this stuff. So in order to present it at a court, it had to be probably something very update, right? Something that already worked in some fashion. I don't know, maybe they tested it against a shield or an armor. I mean, normally this was done. Also in later times with new weapons, new technology, they had fun. Like, they tested the stuff against armor, etc. And in 399, we can think that, of course, following Dionysius' chronology, thus this weapon had already been around, not just as a prototype, but as an actual weapon. And we don't know exactly what may have brought, again, to that kind of invention being say, eventually having so much success, but starting from this specific point in history. As I was saying before, Greek warfare was allowing with lots of opportunities to develop, to employ this kind of weapons. However, you may especially wonder, why wouldn't this weapon be developed or employed before? Like, what do we know that, for example, whether the Assyrians already didn't have this thing, or that it was even something older? Because again, the concept of the crossbow is really simple. And when you look at the early Middle Ages, you know that, I don't know, even the Picts had crossbows still from late Roman times, where the stuff began to revive, perhaps because of many reasons. We will talk about the late Roman crossbow. Normally you don't think about early imperial crossbows, right, in the Roman army. Instead, they were there. They were there surely, first of all, because the catapults were there. So they were exactly the same principle. Secondly, because you don't ever run out of with that stage of technological advancement to say, of the necessity to employ something like a catapult, right? Evidently, what you want to achieve is to have this thing loaded, and you can discharge easily without even having to pull to span the bow at I don't know, under fire, or with there are some advantages of the crossbow. You can for example, shoot it even when you're crouched or something. So that there's a universal functionality. Crossbows are used in the military even today, but you don't think, of course, that we go to war with crossbows. Well, the concept is a bit the same, right? Why this thing at least is documented around that time? And interestingly, it by the sources presented, it is presented like, novelty, right? So evidently something that, at least in that world, had not quite been around much for at least rulers to not to know of it necessarily, but not to have ever seen one operating or having to present one who was better than the other. That's why somebody said, but maybe what they presented there was not even a crossbow; it was an actual catapult of some important size. Also, we don't know whether this stuff existed in somewhere else or not, right? Whether maybe the technology arrived from somewhere else. But it found even in, say, in Paris, where Zopyrus was from, or in this other surroundings, kind of more fertile ground, maybe even skipping some other geographical areas, saying crossing Greece, as we'll see now, arriving from the east, and eventually just finding that adequate need of employment in southern Italy first. this is an interesting point of debate. In fact, Bitten describes, as we were saying before, two machines designed by Zopyrus. One at Cumae in Campania, and it's perhaps in connection with the Sabellian conquest of the city in 421 BC. So in this case, it would have been again Italic tribes, essentially buying this Hellenic technology and having probably also Greek crewmen operating it, etc., in this quite militarized context, because Cumae had been colonized also by the Greeks and so on, but now it was falling in the hands of others. Which is interesting in perspective. Is like saying, I don't know, Orban in the siege of Constantinople in 1453. We're talking about essentially a German or Hungarian background. The guy goes to Constantinople where the Byzantine emperor cannot afford the giant bombard. He goes to the Ottomans that used the bombard at the siege of Constantinople, even exploded and killing Orban in the process, kind of a divine revenge. But just to make you understand, you could have a technology that arrived from another people and still was used, in fact, against that same people, because there was another people that wanted to use it against that people, right? So, and that's the case perhaps in this context as well. The other machine used by Zopyrus, according to Bitten, was at Miletus, however, and this is fascinating because the town was annexated by the Persians in 401 BC, right? This is, by the way, after the Persian Wars, but there was a lot of back and forth, and you know that Miletus was actually the birthplace of Hellenic philosophy, right? It was practically within the Achaemenid Empire historically, and as you know, the Ionian revolts, all the issues that would put the Achaemenids against at least the rebels in the Hellenic world, it was fundamentally within the sphere of the Persians began. So that's an area where you have these are Greeks, but there is a lot of Persian influence, Syrian influence from the previous centuries. The greatest polyarcetic accomplishments historically at that point had been exactly in those places, in Syria and Mesopotamia. So what about Zopyrus? He was from Taras, but he employs this machine also in Miletus. So what's going on with that? Why also Taras would give in fact, birth to the invention of this kind of early guy that was credited with the invention and the development of this stuff, and not any other Hellenic city. Yes, also as we've seen, the Italiote colonies were again exposed to kind of different and kind of wilder type of warfare that was different from the more kind of conventional one of the among the Greeks of the motherland. But why Taras, or why not? I don't know. Even Miletus at this point, right? We don't know about this. Bitten gives us also. Remember, Bitten writes more than a century later, like between the 3rd and the 2nd century BC. So he's adequately kind of aware of what was going on in Asia Minor, because he was from there, and he would, probably also recount what was happening in a place like Miletus with some degree of accuracy. And the voices of this Zopyrus from Taras also are like, they remember that guy was from the other side of the Greek world, and had come from there with this stuff, and it's kind of interesting. So spanning the entire Hellenic space from Cumae to Miletus. The first weapon described by Bitten, so the one of Cumae, is called Mountain Gastraphetes, and it has, according to the source, a 1.5 meter stock and a 2.2 meter bow, right? The second one is that had a 2.2 meter stock attached to a 2.8 meters bow. And the latter could apparently fire 2 missiles at once, which is also kind of not complicated to imagine. Again, the concept is pretty simple. You can create crossbows in many ways. When I was in middle school, I can tell you I created many crossbows that for shooting all kind of stuff with very empirical ways. So the concept was there easily, and you could create a system that would be able to shoot, right? That in this case 2 arrows at a time, about which much has been speculated in a mechanical sense of how was it, right? But it's also boring to think, because we don't know it anyway. We actually have an 11th to 12th century manuscript illustration of Zopyrus Gastraphetes. So this probably stemmed from manuscript drawings of Bitton's machines. However, this is a medieval illumination, and it's relatively complex. Here I inserted it in the background pictures at a point you can easily recognize it. And we don't know, as for many other sources. I mean, we looked at the Notitia Dignitatum, for example, which is from late antiquity, as you know, but we get from later medieval manuscripts that, I don't know, modified maybe the designs or something. Well, here it's a highly technical kind of representation, and we don't know exactly what the medieval drawer was kind of accurately representing or not from the original, for us to understand the exact mechanism of it. But even if it wasn't such a complicated thing, like it must have been naturally a large. You understand also from the dimensions here that these were big catapults. They weren't belly bows, belly shooters, right? So they were full artillery at this point. And the interesting aspect, at least that we know, is that Zopyrus incorporated 2 elements that would eventually enable the leap to the torsion catapult in this description, that are the winched pullback system. So essentially a holding system which allowed the increase of the bow power, and the stand, which made heavier machines practicable, because de facto opening to artillery, because this stuff had also to be aimed evenly at enemy fortifications, something more static, and at that point you needed essentially to ballistically calibrate the shot, right, in ways that required the catapult to stand on its place, right? So when you look at these dimensions, you realize that they were a pretty big thing, right? The Bitton's text is a bit equivocal, because the design of bow machine is not entirely clear per se. For example, the Miletus machine described by Bitton allegedly sat on 30 centimeters pedestal, basis in Greek. It was 2.7 meters long and 90 centimeters wide, plus surmounted by a trestle with a height of 5 feet, so something like 1.5 meters. Bitton later states that the trestle measure, however, 90 centimeters as well. So we don't know exactly. This is typical of this kind of alleged, kind of dramatically advanced, ancient science technology, that even the way they wrote it, right? Consider that these people were always kind of well-off theorists, right? That surely had also something to do with the operation of these machines and so on. But there were, in the Hellenic mindset, what you are contented with is to describe the concept, right? It's just like Ptolemy that calculated through the Earth curvature and the sun rays and everything, like strikingly the actual dimension of the Earth. I mean, almost, but with the means of the time, you understand it's all the on the base of traveling journeys, whatever, all the distances of various localities, and he created some coordinate system to measure, to find their location. But we're not even sure he actually ever drew a map in his life, right? Eventually was done on the base of his coordinates, but what the Greek was interested in, by definition, is just having calculated the coordinates. Then he didn't even care about using the map, because people at the time didn't use maps like with a geographical kind of accurate distance. They just needed to know where to go from a place to another, just like in the case of the Roman itineraria. Right, so the Hellenic mindset was highly theoretical, and again, we owe to it great part of what we elaborated on as in terms of modern science and so on, but not necessarily is there to explain you the actual deal, or using this for exactly because they had to tell you how it worked precisely, and or what kind of use you could do with that. So even when we read Bitten's description of these machines, you have problems of interpreting the whole thing, because if you read, for example, that this trestle was 1.5 meters tall, this machine would have had to, let's say, at least the syrinx and the whole shooting mechanism should have been like 2 meters above ground, and we don't even know in this sense how it would have been operating, right? It's definitely something pretty large, and you need it just to fix this, so it's not like a crossbow, at least a hand one anymore. And there has been kind of a debate among antiquists, philologists, etc. about this, because say, how the hell was this thing described by Bitten? The point, more generally, is who cares about this? I mean, okay, Bitten had this work written, he described this artillery, whatever, but what's the point knowing how far and wide catapults spread, and how, of course, there were of any possible kind to know Bitten's one that was not necessarily a prototype and already just conceptually displays some essential features of catapult mechanism system that also you just need to have in order to operate this thing. So there have been various models proposed, but it's mostly technical history, and I don't even know how interested you are practically in it, because again, once I told you like the mechanism, maybe I sound a bit Greek in mindset, but I look at also the practical side. I mean, looking essentially at also just by comparison at the Middle Ages, like when you realize that there was, like it was in the ancient world, an incredibly generic terminology for certain types of weapons, and the sources fundamentally didn't give a damn even to tell you how large or size, because it obviously means that there were of many kinds. Sometimes they tell you, oh, look, there was a big one, it was huge, it could shoot, I don't know, this large of a stone. Yeah, okay, but then this simply means that all the others were different kind or sizes, and that we know that normally just by the overall quantities were, when they are given to us, that there were many more smaller ones than the larger ones, of course, and that they practically operated all in concert when besieging a place, or even when they were sometimes used against the enemy troops. And more or less you have an idea of how they could even be, right? So there was no standardization, there was not kind of industrial production, so it's obvious that every machine was also somehow different by a degree. It was sometimes even built on the spot, and depending also on the material. Consider even as far as we would operate this machinery. We've seen how the Romans, for example, during the First Punic War or the Second, they operated in Sicily. we know their allies there so the same places where, as we've seen, these machines had developed originally, apparently. The allies would simply give it to them, and then they would, I don't know, when they conquered Carthago Nova or Carthage, they found there tons of catapults the Carthaginians had, and they simply took them, and we don't know anything about how it eventually integrated those machines that would also perish at a point in their military. But we know eventually the Romans simply kept developing on the base of that kind of Hellenistic technology, and it was also the only one technically. I mean, what kind of catapult do you want to build for what, right? For the military needs of the time, more or less, it's going always to be the same catapult. There were other concepts. There was the onager, that is more like a spoon, right, kind of catapult. It works on another principle, but basically it's either that or the ballista type that, in fact, the same Romans by a certain degree, given that many crewmen, many also in imperial times, as you understand, engineers came from the Hellenistic world, etc., were called catapults, which technically would be, in fact, the more proper term, at least if you want to attach some. But it was actually a generic one. That's why it's proper, because it could be different things, even in terms of size, right? So the Romans, perhaps between ballista and scorpio, they distinguish from larger to smaller things, but actually that's also a complex thing. I made a video, if I'm not wrong, about Roman artillery that explains it a bit. But in the Hellenic world, everything was also more generically determined. And they didn't need to explain you, because probably, I mean, it's that simple. It's a freaking crossbow, right? Even if it's a small hand one or a large artillery type, it works always practically in the same way. What's the need of... It's the only kind of artillery that exists, so what's the need of even losing time to describe that? We always have to realize it, right? Why don't, I don't know, even medieval knights talk, the few ones that wrote, talk about how they fought battles? Because battles, in their mindset, were always the same throughout all history. It wasn't the concept that this thing would evolve, would change, that there was a sense to document this, or the means, or the available sources to carry out some studies. And what for, right? The next day you should have been sent to another camp expedition. You would have had many more important things to think about, and that's where we tend to go astray from the times that we are pretending to understand without caring about them, right? So here it's a bit like the same, even in such a highly theoretically advanced world like the Hellenistic one, because there was also a lot of practice that you don't see. Again, most of what we know about Hellenistic technology derives from court scientists, so people that entered like the Library of Alexandria, that in the Hellenistic world nobody visited, just these court scientists and nobody else. It was huge, so these people studied just a few things and were mostly interested in natural history, and what we can't get technologically excited about from our squalidly modernistic perspective is just like a tiny part, right? And nobody else, like the Romans actually went to, strangely enough, they actually frequented libraries more than the Greeks when they had them, right? Because also they were more practically oriented by a degree, and they were kind of less sclerotic, at least at the beginning, than the Hellenistic society that was just like everybody in the latifundia and just the monarch and the court at the top, right? So that's pretty much it, right? That affects deeply the way you get to know about those times and technologies, right? I will not digress here on also the difference between classical Greece and Hellenistic times, because at least here we are mostly talking about Hellenistic times anyway, from 399. We can think there was some tilt and swivel mechanism to aim better, this stuff. However, again, consider that probably also the largest weapons, so the ones that would need it when they were fixed somewhere, were employed to target the city walls. So even if, of course, you could and you would want to aim precisely, because some of these, they were highly precise weapons, as you understand, by a degree, and so that we know from different accounts that everybody would try to. We've seen it also in the video about the siege of Acre the other day, right, to kind of raise his head above the ramparts, could be transpassed immediately, right? So they needed maybe to operate this precisely, like with a great mobility. However, the larger ones, as you know, would also develop to shoot massive boulders that at that point the problem was not kind of adding to the mechanism something that could make the shot more, I don't know, adjustable. The most important thing was just to, in the first place, shoot the damn thing, right? And we tried. The interesting thing is that we tried to replicate some of the largest tens of talents projectile shooting mechanism of the ancient world, and these things break down at the first shots, right? So we surely at the time they knew how to build them in a much more effective way than we do, and that's what we have lost forever, right? That's another thing. In fact, there is no linear technological advancement. We will never be able to replicate anything like a medieval sword. We will never be able to replicate anything like an ancient catapult, right? We can do whatever, but the way they built it, and the way the secrets, the practice, the experience, the knowledge behind that is lost. And it doesn't matter how technological advanced we will be, we will never be able to replicate an actual weapon of those times. It's all bullshit. If any person who sells you this stuff, remember, yeah, of course, great. Say, loosely speaking, you can replicate it, but you cannot pretend it to be like it was at the time, and especially you haven't the palest idea of how it was used and operated at the time doctrinally. And that's the thing that you must understand very, very concretely. Okay, I will not digress on my usual rant about how and why reenactors think that they can't do this, because it's just like a childish delusion. But I just warn you, because it's full of actual adult people who believe that this can be done, and that there is an actual positive understanding from that it can be spent, like, say, I actually shot one of this stuff. There's no such thing, right? And deluding oneself about it, it's sad enough, and scientifically and also morally speaking. And if you don't understand why, well, just know that that's the problem. And I have made plenty of videos about this topic, so I'm not going to repeat myself in this one, because otherwise it would rant too much in any case. There is a feud, and this to tell you also, what is that you want to replicate, by the way, because different scholars think different things, right? And it's not building your own thing that makes the thing as it was at the time. Since Bitten's passages are somehow foggy regarding certain technical aspects, there have been some scholars who essentially decided to replicate these systems, or at least to draw sketch about them, by rationalizing or normalizing or whatever they thought they were izing that kind of description to create a real catapult. But this brought the, say, interpretational license to go too far, because there are some elements that are not described, there are others that are in another way. And so what you have, yes, it's an interesting thing, but again, it's not what he actually described, and especially you don't have an actual evidence to match your creation with, right? So there is kind of a more philological school that says, look, this text says a very specific thing and you didn't replicate that because maybe to you it sounds as if it doesn't make sense, but in the way he was describing that, and don't think that the people who read this stuff, in order to read ancient languages, you must have actually studied them for real, right? And to have acquired an actual semantic, etymological sensitivity. Just being a philologist, for example, just with a purely literary background, also without a military historical one, is a trap, right? There are things that I read from philologists say, oh my god, what's complicated, what does this thing mean? If you're a military historian who studied certain aspects of, tactics, etc., you say, this is what he means, right? And if you haven't been there as a philologist because you're not a military historian, you cannot understand it, and vice versa. I'm not a philologist. I developed a sensitivity on my own, because when you're a historian, you develop a sensitivity to many things, but I don't actually specialize just in that. So the question is, who's right, who's wrong? Right? You just have this info. You have, first of all, to frame this info, not just pretending, okay, just I copy and paste the text from an internet translated source, and then I say that's how it was. That's unfortunately how people are going to be transformed nowadays, because they probably not to understand the difference anymore. And that's, again, extremely sad and disturbing in so many ways. All these debates are naturally legitimate, but how this Gastraphetes, the mountain one that, for example, described by Bittel, what the hell is that? Right? Or, again, there is an explanation, but we don't know exactly how the whole thing actually worked. Like, we don't know anything about, for example, the actual existence of a tilt and swivel joint, as some have wanted to reconstruct. It would make sense, but we also don't have any evidence. And even if we had, that doesn't tell us exactly how it would have worked, how they made it work, and so on. And again, never underestimate that if you don't know the doctrine of the employment of these weapons, you cannot know exactly even what they had to do, which is another problem that, especially, in fact, people who are fixated with replicas and such things always do. They want to copy things without actually even being expert about how these weapons were used historically, and you want to keep reasoning your own way. And that's when disasters happen. Right, and being an archaeologist has nothing to do, for example, with any actual better capacity to understand how this thing works, because you do more material stuff. It's just a mental illness. It's an autoimmune disease, and it's spreading like crazy among people. Again, you're not special because you have a 3 years or 5 years, even an 8 years degree, right? The only thing that makes sense is the method that you use. And you have to prove it to be correct and on the base of evidence. Otherwise, it's bullshit. And I don't care if you made it work your own way, because you don't know anything about how it was there concretely, and thus it's just an hypothesis. It can be a better or worse one than the other, but it's not how it was. Let's stop pretending that anyone can. Right? It doesn't matter if you actually have even the pieces at some point in history. You don't know, if you don't know how they were employed, how tactics worked at the time, how warfare was in general at the time, you do not have a clue. It's as if you lacked, 90% of what you need to be more or less the correct thing. Right? So, unfortunately, we live in a disgustingly, materialistically, and technologistically biased age, in which people think that just through matter you can actually understand things. No, it's actually a disadvantaged position. First of all, you have to make your brain work, which is much more difficult than what you have been habituated by a normal primary education, even in the first world. So stop flattering yourself, because it's really not the case, especially in this time in history. So there is, in fact, an amount of speculations we can make about not just the employment of the Gastraphetes specifically, but also about the possible adaptation of these weapons, the possible adaptation of fortifications to such early artillery. Before the death of Dionysius of Syracuse in 367 BC, the sovereign had enjoyed over 30 years of friendship with Sparta, and had even made later overtures to Athens, reason for which we may hypothesize that such bow machine would have traveled from Sicily to mainland Greece. In fact, we know, among some, actually a few hints, that, for example, a catapult arrow in the source Catapelticum Bellos was apparently displayed at Sparta around more or less this time, to the general dismay of the observers. Another thing I would like to point out in this regard is, before I said that the this stuff was probably already around, maybe people knew, like, you see how problematic a source can be, to the dismay of whom, right, of the common people, or, just maybe not, maybe even some of the military commanders in a city like Sparta, right? Sparta was also quite reactionary, though, and traditionalist in many ways. So the question is, how new was such technology, and how, let's say, impressive it should have been? Because these machines, like, as I was saying before, were useful in sieges, but they weren't quite the only thing. Like, without normal soldiers storming the fortifications, you wouldn't have anything. Like, these machines were mostly just supporting the attacks and things like that. They weren't decisive stuff. They weren't breaking the walls just in letting the enemies pouring in. That's not how it worked. Until very, very, very late in time, arguably even still to this day. Of course, it's not artillery that makes the thing only, and the same fortifications are useless if they're not manned, and that's mostly who is around there and can defend it. That makes really the attacks from the other side that is going to make the difference. So again, remember that the Greeks were a bit kind of fascinated with this kind of theoretical idea. There was also a later Roman source that was quite secular, modernistically minded, let's say, already at the time, that said, look at this catapults, and this is the most powerful weapon that not just has ever been created, but that can only be created, because basically it's over, right? Nobody can create a more powerful weapon. The military technology has reached the pinnacle in human history and it cannot be expanded anymore. In those times, naturally, such mechanisms as later ones would remain, again, secondary instruments, right, of war. However, they impressed, right? And again, this Hellenic idea of saying, okay, we can start toying with the ballistics of it, with the weights, with the distances. We can make this the stuff, ever more precise. We can impress people who have never seen it. It's just like, I don't know, elephants or chariots, whatever. Eventually, who does take over the entire thing? I mean, just a guy with a shield, a couple of javelins, and a sword, right? So it's difficult to interpret the thing, but consider that these are also very archaic times. So the idea that such catapult arrow would seem like, I don't know, maybe because it was huge and they said it could be shot at great distances, everybody said, oh my god, right? It's terrifying. There are other sources saying, oh my god, this thing can trespass people, can do it's over. Like the entire, now, like today, people give too importance to technology. Oh my god, that the country has that weapon. Oh my god, what a terrible thing. What can they do? And then maybe doctrinally it's completely useless. It's like tactical nuclear weapons. Normally it takes like tens of tactical nuclear weapons to wipe out an entire armored division. The question is, who's going to use them for that purpose, right? So it's a bit like an artillery at that time. It probably was very impressive because it was new, but in that sense it was new probably because it was relatively useless. And even though it spread importantly, still it mostly remained confined to siege warfare, and it didn't really affect much what the core of warfare in pre-industrial times. Of course, or at least until gunpowder came around. But gunpowder weapons were also, fundamentally just at the beginning also less effective than trebuchet in something, right? So everything appears gradually, very gradually, and at this time probably there hadn't been ever such a thing. Here, what really actually seems to be interesting is the capacity to create a torsion engine of that size, right? Well, the real magic here is not much in the structure per se, and the triggers, in the the pointing, the all the stuff in the aiming devices. It is in actual the mechanics of the strings, right? How they were, all these various tendons that were put together, how they could operate also consistently without breaking, how they had to be maintained. So consider these weapons cost an unspeakable lot, right? You would think that, I don't know, this is just like a piece of wood with, I don't know, this material that perhaps is a bit less difficult to find here and there. The question is, it was really, that's exactly the point. I mean, the cost of what you needed, also just even in skilled craftsmen could produce that and assemble this thing, it's the entire problem, right? And considering that you would need these weapons to speed up the siege operations and so on, there was an enormous pressure to produce more, also among the defenders, to counter the enemy machines and so on. So this would just develop to a degree that had to satisfy an economy that also didn't have infinite resources to produce this stuff, even though it could seem cheaper, and say this machine was maybe much more costly than, and it was surely much more costly than even just hundreds of soldiers normally armed and equipped. You'd say, how it's possible? Because again, because the price is not intrinsic to an absolute value of matter. This changes on base of your needs. And of course, if this stuff had been everything, it would have supplanted even soldiers, at least in how we know ancient warfare, and later one in those thickly packed formations of essentially of horsemen or infantrymen clashing against each other, and that's it, right? Even elephants were arguably more expandable than these machinery, right? And you couldn't quite just find them and the materials needed to create them everywhere. So that's why probably it hadn't been around up to that point, and just now in that consistently developed and wealthy time with lots of surplus by some degree, that was reflected it would make the cause, for example, of the same fortifications. The necessity of creating such weapons arose, right? So it's all that gradual and complex. It's not just, oh my god, they discovered this stuff, now let's use it. Maybe they knew it since ever. Maybe they knew it since the second millennium BC. But what the hell do we know about that, right? It's likely that somebody had already been testing, because what's difficult about that? The bows existed. This concept of having just a bow that you put on a surface of some sort, also a child can use. You can argue that yes, because if nobody had used it ever since, it was maybe an innovation, and that children today know what crossbows are, they could easily replicate them. I argue that it's such a simple concept that you can't you can't leave for millennia without before the wide employment of such torsion and catapults, and not thinking, it can obviously be created. You have bows, you know what they do, it's the same concept, right? The problem, however, with this hints about the possibility of Syracusan or Italiote or Siciliote factors and catapults may have spread throughout the first half of the 4th century BC in mainland Greece, supposing that it was not developing already there, because again, how fast do technologies travel? And why can't there be the same creation in different places, in different times, independently? You can never say independently because everything was interconnected, but there are instances where you know that certain weapons, for example, developed with some design that is identical in more or less at the same time, even in places that were very distant and that obviously weren't affecting each other in terms of direct warfare and so on. So that's a very interesting topic, but it pertains to the philosophy of science. Today it's still hardcore material one, but it's a concrete one, but again, the technological differences at the time were minimal, right? The world remained for a very long time the same thing. These people lived in a world that they basically didn't see changing, right? At least the first who began to see changing that fast were exactly the Greeks, because they had sorted out certain things theoretically that seemed like a big deal, including the aforementioned steam engine that, however, there was no real concrete application capability at the time in a functional sense, in an economical sense, in an advantageous sense. However, our contemporary archaeologists and historians, when somebody began to consider again the spread of the catapult technology, began to look at this timeline and saying, okay, well, maybe we can look at some Hellenic fortification of the first half of the 4th century BC. And maybe, I don't know, we dated it before to different decades, but now we think that they may date to the first half of the 4th century BC. Why? Because of the development of such bow machines that would have allegedly, in fact, modified the structured fortification exactly to be lodged in there, right? And this is a very controversial idea as well, because there are some Theban and Athenian towers dating from this time surviving that, if measured, would make it somehow difficult to think that they could lodge functionally or with a real tactical advantage such weapons, right? For example, the great corner tower of the Athenian fort at Aigosthena, dating to 343 BC, has indeed some above, some windows, right, in the upper chamber that are quite interesting, because it's otherwise the rest of the fortification doesn't have any. People said, look, I'm not making names about the scholars specifically because I don't think they are even worth being mentioned in this context. And so look, this windows were designed for artillery. The question, though, if you make a simple measurement of how large the artillery should have been, you realize that you can hardly accommodate more than, actually there are more more windows than the actual space for an equal number of artillery pieces would allow, right? So the question is, why creating them in the first place? You understand that, yes, in fact, these windows could have been created for just maybe a Gastraphetes. Why not? Right, so something smaller. So there, it's not because the catapult, it's because you start needing some kind of better employment of troops that high, and also for banally, also considering all the weapons in fact could be used at the time, just for, evidently for just reasons of sight, right? You wanted to facilitate long-range surveillance rather than, okay, I will shoot from there. You can look at windows, and especially when they are so high, and simply say, well, that's created because to lodge artillery better there. Why? Right? Where's the proof of that? Artillery of significant range at that height would have needed, again, a size that inside does not match with the numbers of windows, because again, there's not enough space for that artillery. So, but everybody said, "Oh my God, it must be like that," and they shifted the dating of this structures in order to say, look, since they started talking about artillery around that time, it must have. We must change like the dating from whichever other bases are architecturally, archaeologically, whatever, because it sounds cool, doesn't it? Right? It feels like we have known something now. And where is the proof of this? Where is the actual demonstration of it? When even the simplest concept, like, is there enough space for the artillery on the basis of the functional, the number of the windows for facilitating such functionality, and it is not there. Like, how do you reason? Right? Why do you need to come up with these ideas? And especially, why do you think also, again, that there could have not been lots of other weapons that could have been operated from distances? Another problem, by the way, with this windows and the entire structure of is that these weapons, especially in the way they were employed against other specific targets, like maybe other engines or whatever, should have required a greater mobility of some sort, right? Also, from the above, you can, yes, shoot over lower targets, but probably the best way to employ these catapults was, say, in front of some doors or breaches where you thought the enemy would storm, and as soon as it appeared, you could shoot this massive darts that would transpass a single hoplite in one shot, and so, or suppressing something on the walls or things like that. Leaving aside that you would be able to do that in some, to at least to prevent enemies pouring from there, not quite with missile weapons, but using, let's say, other missile weapons, what was more effective here. Think about the shooting, speed and everything. Like if you have 10 archers, or maybe say 30 archers or 50 archers, that's something that already can significantly suppress a certain area. Then you need heavy infantry anyway, because without that you can't even get probably past the hoplite just per se, because again, armor was somehow pretty effective, at least in the heaviest cases, against arrows, right? So, or even shields, hence perhaps the same name of catapultan, because it evidently pointed at the fact that at least shields initially could be easily pierced like that, but not armor, for example. So even in that, you should provide with some explanation that, again, we don't know. So if you don't realize that also these weapons were used together and unavoidably with lots of others, like these catapults were never employed like individually out there without support. right? And the other thing that can be said instead is for the actual hand crossbows, the Gastraphetes proper, that was, aside from some rests or whatever, was used individually, and that actually makes more sense because it's easier just to point it, to calibrate, to aim, just without all the difficulties of moving such larger pieces. And this is crucial because it speaks of something, in fact, more similar to what was the crossbow in medieval times. In later times, the late medieval crossbows were, and also the late antique crossbows were different from the Gastraphetes. Importantly enough, they had evolved in another direction. They were less powerful, by the way, than most bows by a degree, but probably could be used more easily, which is also the reason why also the crossbow was spread so quickly, also in medieval times. So these are things that I discussed also elsewhere. I'm not going to repeat myself, but just for the record, just remember that there are so many factors involved. So even attempting to describe how a Gastraphetes could be used like is complicated. Probably it did really have a greater importance in siege operations, for the simple fact that, again, it was slow to reload. It needed this kind of, as we've seen, you had to literally move your body entirely and accordingly to reload it effectively. So also what you do in open field is naturally subjected to where your troops are stationed. Of course, the Gastraphetes was used also in open field, right? There is no doubt about that. If you are covered by heavy infantry, by cavalry, or even you want even to jump around in front of the enemy lines with this stuff, if you have a loaded, in fact, hand catapult, you can do it. The problem is, what's the collective employment of this? Because that's basically the only thing that matters on the battlefield. You can have lots of these guys operating autonomously and not doing like independently and really doing a partial damage. What really actually works on the battlefield is consequential volleys on a specific unit, right? Not even with precision, but with, say, an accurate concerted shooting, right? So that's where you would mostly look at as far as also any bow or even sling shot is concerned, right? We don't have much evidence for that either, meaning that we don't have like a specific evidence of how on a collective basis this weapons were employed. However, again, that's universally, you have to shoot projectiles altogether. That's collectively the most effective way of doing it. And on the base of this, you can think that the Gastraphetes worked pretty much in the same way, where there were surely some specialized units of sort that could be employed together with the other missile troops on the battlefield, and it could just eventually disorder itself, of course, starting shooting in a more disorderly fashion, but generally speaking, it had an important firepower. The question, though, is also how flexible their employment was in the field, for which, again, it's likely that most of these troops would be garrisoning the fortresses. The concept is simple. You have a greater greater pull than the average, right? So this thing in theory is more powerful. But it seems to have also less sensibility to it. I mean, when you span a bow, a normal one, I mean, you you also feel properly the bow. You have all kind of a physicality entering into place in sensing where the projectile is going to land on. With this thing, you can't quite do that, right? The best use, in spite of a greater pull, seems to have been literally at a close range, closer than, say, the average slingshot or the average bow shot. And with an important degree of precision, with a weapon that, as we've seen, you could simply place also somewhere on the edge of a window or something, so to be more precise, to just more comfortably aim, protected, say, by the fortification, and designed to pierce through significant armor or defense of some sort, against especially the stormtroopers, that were technically the hoplites, right, in these contexts, and that thus could inflict devastating damage even against very powerful armor at a close range, just with a click, right, and pressing the trigger. And that seems also, that's why crossbows were so popular in siege warfare as well. Also, javelins could be effective, or even more, actually, than the Gastraphetes. And it does seem evident that, at least we don't know how widespread the Gastraphetes was, or if it was even widely spread in the first place, but in fact it seems not, by a degree. It seems that not even just the bow, but the sling was more, more spread than the Gastraphetes or any other weapon. So the missile weapon, of course. So the difficulty there is probably the fact that we don't know the measures between these weapons. We don't know how they performed, how they employed them in combat, tactically, how many were around, and it's an incredibly complex system for which we base ourselves mostly just on the frequency in which they're mentioned in the sources compared to other weapons. Right, so again, javelin could be sometimes much more effective than one of these weapons. Sometimes that we cannot, if not, as I did before, kind of stereotype, there could be advantage in using this. Probably everything was also much more flexible than we think. As I said before, there were surely many different types of these crossbows, even for hand use, different size, different pull, and so on. And the impression is that, again, it was a minority weapon that didn't, also iconographically speaking, is not very represented. We don't get the impression that it was just like a popular weapon. And the idea that kind of simpler and kind of, say, weapons that were more felt in the way they operated, like a bow, right, just by the user, were still more, they were handier in a way. That was thus also more effective by degree. They took less to reload, and they fit better this entire scenario. Javelin warfare was surely much more spread than the Gastraphetes one, just to make an example, that we're sure. And the same goes for surely also other bows and slings. As far as the catapult development, like how long it took, as we've seen, we can't even say when this technology came around precisely. So it's likely that the smaller weapons were initially created, and then they started seeing that they could create simply larger, because maybe they knew the technology, but they had never implemented it yet. So the larger this thing became, and in, as we've seen, it happened in a moment also of intense warfare, right? From the end of the 5th, the beginning of the 4th century BC. I mean, it's a moment in which Western warfare steps up significantly. Well, at that point, you realize that they there was some systemic reason for which these weapons came around, and they began to develop, especially in the form of artillery, right? That again, that probably explains also what I was saying before regarding how the crossbow instead could be used by a single person, because artillery is at a certain distance somehow safe, as long as, of course, there is always other artillery there that is trying to counter you, but at least you can protect these pieces because they are few enough to cause significant damage, and to be, say, protected, covered by some, I don't know, barriers, some covers, whatever. And you can try, again, with minimal movements, by keeping the weapon just exactly where it is, shoot every once in a while, and mostly, again, covering the enemy assault, the assaults to the fortifications, and or, again, when the enemy came at very close range, to start taking down the elite, the spearhead, the heavies, with these at short range, thanks to the significant power. And fundamentally just exploiting the characteristics that this weapon has, say, functionally, and leading to more dynamic missile troops, the task of permeating these entire spaces. But it's obvious that the catapult develops in kind of stiller battlefields, right? So in a position warfare against fortification, enemy trenches, things like this, and that's the reason why it develops so significantly as artillery, as a fixed weapon, and you don't, which is represented in iconographically in a consistent way, whereas the Gastraphetes, the crossbow per se, is really not. Right, today we do not talk about also the interesting aspect that seems to have been that at least the crossbow is documented around this time, but nobody really talks about it in the form of a hand weapon between these times and fundamentally late antiquity, which is almost 1 millennium of history in between. The reason I just explained, I mean, what existed in between these times was kind of a more direct, open engagement, a faster engagement that would make the crossbow that you had to literally reload with your entire weight, fixing it somewhere, whatever, to slow, right, to be, competitive with a bow. Consider that making a comparison with the medieval times is not entirely safe, because there was also a different degree of armor protection. There were different arms on the battlefield. In antiquity, was fundamentally among these places the infantry that decided battles. In medieval times, it's the cavalry. So usually at least. However, so this is the reason why you can't properly compare even just what you see medieval times with the crossbow and later. As I said, in late antiquity also, crossbows there seem to have been handier weapons, right? And perhaps, yes, connected with still a more fortified kind of defensive context of late antiquity that saw a process of encapsulation of some sort, etc. We also know much less about siege warfare in these early times than in later times. So it's so complicated to simply come up with a statement saying it was like this, that I'm just presenting you the concept per se. However, the deadlock represented by, say, position warfare between Athens and Sparta, just to make an example. Very close cities, after all, but still entrenched, each one in their place, may have, with the fortifications that existed, etc., have to do with the development, in part, also of this kind of weapons in some places. Then the great conquests of the Macedons would bring these weapons to be used in ever larger numbers and also bigger size, at least in larger pieces. And this is practically it, right? I think that you can appreciate the general development of these weapons in a kind of sensitive fashion, an intuitive fashion, than by saying, okay, it was just like this at this time and we're sure of it. We aren't, and that's where we mostly get with the with our inquiry, right? And I think that you can benefit from this kind of exercise where you're kind of doubting of your own insight sometimes, to say, okay, but are we sure that we know something when we actually don't have any firm ground in which to stand? Skepticism is not always the best thing, but at least objectivity should bring us to say, okay, that there is the likelihood that certain things are not exactly as we are normally told. I still have to make videos about polyursatics at this time, and the Gastraphetes is just perhaps like a small introduction to the problem. For today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. I thank you as always heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.